Why is there an alley in Chicago called the Alley of Death? Well, as you can probably guess, it's not a happy story. But because I have what you might call a morbid curiosity about these things, I decided to take a stroll down this infamous passageway just to experience it firsthand. Now, the Alley of Death might sound like a haunted house attraction with its seemingly over-the-top name, but I can assure you it's a very well-earned title, because it's where a very real and terrible thing happened many decades ago. And before I continue with this video, I first want you to just listen to this clip of me walking through the alley for just a few seconds to see if you feel or notice anything. Now, I don't know if you noticed anything, but despite the fact that I'm in the middle of a huge city on a beautiful weekend day, there still seems to be a stillness and a sadness that really seems to permeate throughout this alley, even after all these years. Hence why it has earned the nickname, the Alley of Death. One fact that really surprised me about the Iroquois Theatre fire was that it had double the death toll of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Now, of course, the fire of 1871 is more famous because it turned Chicago into this apocalyptic landscape and destroyed thousands of buildings and displaced tens of thousands of people. But as far as the human death toll goes, the Iroquois is actually twice as devastating. And so I wanted to dive a little more into this tragedy because it's a piece of history that doesn't get talked about too much because it's horribly depressing, but it's also one of the reasons why we started suddenly seeing new building codes and new fire codes, and why we started seeing these panic bars on doors in public buildings everywhere in the US. And I say one of the reasons because they actually already existed in the UK after the Victoria Hall fire of 1883, which killed 183 kids because the exit door was bolted shut. And I guess we didn't take the hint in the US that something that horrific could happen because the exits in public buildings continued to be really hard to find, they weren't clearly marked, or they were just locked altogether. Today, it's the James M. Nederlander Theater that stands at 24 West Randolph Street in downtown Chicago. But in 1903, it was the site of the newly constructed Iroquois Theatre, and it was built to impress. Chicago at the time had just surpassed Philadelphia as America's second most populous city right behind New York, and the Windy City was always trying to find ways to stand out as a center of industry and innovation. So, it only made sense to build a huge, luxurious theater as a way to grab the country's attention, and no expense was spared, at least when it came to making it look impressive. Investigations would later reveal that the theater was built without any fire alarms or sprinkler system. There were also no operational pipes for firefighters to connect their hoses. But not to worry. The advertisements and even the programs noted that the theater was absolutely fireproof because it was built with steel and concrete. And yes, this would make the building itself fireproof, but the materials and basically everything inside the theater was highly combustible. All told, the Iroquois cost more than $1 million by the time it opened in November of 1903. And keep in mind, this was at a time when the average annual salary was around $900. So the Iroquois Theatre was definitely the symbol of opulence and self-importance that Chicago was so desperately seeking. And it definitely would get the city attention, just not exactly in the way that they had hoped. In the highly unlikely event of an emergency, the architect Benjamin Marshall said that the theater could be empty in 5 minutes if all 30 exits were used. That was assuming, of course, that the exits were all clearly marked, which they weren't, or that they were all going to be unlocked, which they weren't. In a book about the disaster called Tinderbox by Anthony Hatch, he writes, Deputy Building Inspector Edward Laughlin, a 10-year department veteran who had never taken a civil service examination, but who had the responsibility of inspecting the Iroquois daily during its construction, issued his final report prior to the theater's opening in the form of a verbal statement to his boss. He said the place was completed and okay. Now, in case you couldn't already tell, the events leading up to the Iroquois Theatre disaster play out like most large-scale tragedies of the time. Greed, bravado, gross negligence, corruption, an utter lack for humanity, all the ingredients for disaster. And that's exactly what happened on the afternoon of December 30th, 1903. Inside the theater, it was standing room only as about 2,000 people watched the stage curtain draw back to reveal the second act of a musical called Mr. Bluebeard. This was a massive production starring a popular actor of the time named Eddie Foy, along with more than 200 other performers. Hanging above the stage were nearly 300 heavily painted wooden set pieces. And for a fire, these set pieces were essentially old logs soaked in gasoline. Around 3:15, the performers on stage were singing a piano ballad called In the Pale Moonlight. And that's when one of the stage lights shorted out and sparked one of the stage curtains. Now, one might think this would be the point where the performers on stage would stop performing and point at the stage curtain that's on fire and say, "We need to exit the building." But no, as the saying goes, the show must go on. The star of the play looked down at the orchestra and told them to play anything. Keep your orchestra up, keep your music going. This was essentially what the band on the Titanic would end up doing a few years later to try to keep people calm. But as fires tend to do when they're surrounded by flammable items, this one grew, and it grew quickly. Some of the crew attempted to put out the fire with a substance called kill fire. This was a tube of powder that was used to put out small domestic fires in the kitchen. So, needless to say, this did not help put out a roaring fire. In fact, the fire investigator would later say that using kill fire was about as effective as throwing table salt. The stage crew then attempted to lower the asbestos fire curtain to contain the fire to the stage, but it got snagged halfway down, and it would later turn out that this curtain was mostly made of wood pulp anyway, so not exactly a great fire retardant. After it crawled up the curtains, it reached the wooden scenery panels, which were covered in flammable paint and lacquer. Audience members could see the situation was quickly getting out of control, and the actors, who finally realized there was no hope of putting out the fire, made their escape through a rear stage door. But when they did, the rush of air from the open door mixed with the growing fire, resulting in an explosive ball of flames shooting into the upper balconies. As the flames continued to shoot out from the stage, the entire theater became engulfed in dark, noxious smoke. Hundreds of people rushed to the exits, only to find that some of the doors were jammed or locked, while other exits were concealed behind curtains. Meanwhile, the people in the balconies were rushing down the stairs to find that the gates had been locked to prevent people in the cheaper balcony section from sneaking into the main gallery for a better seat. These stairwells quickly turned into tangled masses of people who either suffocated from the smoke or were crushed by the crowd. Others on the top floor managed to find the fire escapes facing what would soon become the Alley of Death, and just when they thought things couldn't get any worse, they realized that the escapes were frozen, so they couldn't actually lower them to get to the ground safely. People in the building next door offered ladders for them to crawl across, but a lot of people fell or jumped just out of desperation. Some tried to even cushion their fall by landing on top of bodies that had already fallen. It was, all in all, as you can imagine, a really horrific scene, and in the end, 602 people would lose their lives. Victims were piled in the alley until they could be identified or taken away to the morgue. It's very odd to think that this now quiet, unassuming alley was once the scene of a nightmare where bodies were stacked 6 feet high in places. And to this day, the Iroquois Theatre remains Chicago's deadliest fire and the second worst building fire in American history, behind the World Trade Center. So, who was responsible for this highly preventable disaster? Well, to make a long story short, nobody, at least according to a grand jury. The negligence, in fact, was so widespread that a jury couldn't pin the blame on any particular individual. Yes, you heard that right. There was so much negligence and so much corruption, even within the mayor's office, that the jury couldn't even be bothered to untangle this web of deceit. They did indict 5 men, including the theater owner William Davis, the building commissioner George Williamson, and Edward Laughlin. If you recall, this was the guy whose safety report at the Iroquois Theatre simply said, "Okay." In the end, the defense successfully argued that the city's fire ordinances were invalid, leading the judge to dismiss the case altogether. As a result, no one was held criminally liable for the deaths of more than 600 people, and to add insult to injury, none of the survivors or victims' families received any compensation. The theater owner, William Davis, who was acquitted, told reporters, "No human agency could have prevented the theater catastrophe. Everything known to architecture, science, and art was used to make the theater the safest in the world. Why should we be charged with murder because the audience stampeded and the ushers lost their reason?" The only person who ever actually served any jail time in connection with the fire was a bar owner who robbed the dead bodies while his business was being used as a temporary morgue. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, Chicago Mayor Carter Harrison closed dozens of public buildings in the city for months, including some 35 theaters, until they passed safety inspections. Over the next few months and years, a bunch of new laws and building codes came into play. This included mandatory upgrades like doors that actually opened outward and stayed unlocked, exit lights, automatic sprinklers, and fire alarm systems. All of the things that the Iroquois Theatre should have had, but didn't, simply because the owners wanted to open in time for the holiday season. Despite the massive loss of human life, the damage to the theater was actually pretty superficial, and within a year, it was gutted and reopened as the Colonial Theater. This closed in the mid-1920s and was torn down to make room for the Oriental Theater, which was renamed the James M. Nederlander Theater in 2019. If you're interested in learning more about the ins and outs of the Iroquois Theater disaster and reading more personal accounts, then I highly recommend reading Anthony Hatch's Tinderbox, which covers all the infuriating details of what should have happened but didn't. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you stuck around this long, please do hit the like button so we can share the story with more people. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.